Welcome to the lecture for Research Methods. Be talking today about manipulating variables, which is something that you'll need to know how to do if you're wanting to design an experimental study or oftentimes with a quasi-experimental study. And remember, the variable we manipulate is the independent variable, and then the variable or variables we measure are the dependent variables. So this lecture focusing on independent variables. Well, in terms of manipulating these independent variables, what kind of things impact the conclusions we can draw? Well, the type of manipulation you choose, the reliability of that manipulation, and of course the validity of that manipulation. So, what are the different ways you can manipulate an independent variable? Well, you can break it down into two kind of large types. The first being instructional manipulation, which is the most common. Right, so this is simply whenever you're manipulating an independent variable, you're going to have at least two groups, right? And you're going to do something to one group differently than you do to the other group. Or another way of saying it is one group will experience things differently than a second group. And for an instructional manipulation, you manipulate the instructions you give them, right? And this can be done by giving them pencil and paper instructions over video, audio recording, computer screen, whatever, just where you're telling them to do different things. Right? So giving oral or written instructions that differ across groups, that's the most common way to manipulate an independent variable. And one of the reasons it's so common is because it's easy to standardize. It's easy to make sure that everybody in your experimental group gets told exactly the same thing because you just gave them the exact same instructions. And everybody in your control group or your comparison group got exactly the same instructions, right? So it's standardized. So it's one of the big advantages of instructional manipulation. Downside, instructional manipulations can sometimes leave the door open to misunderstandings. People may misinterpret the instructions, misread them. They may impose their own beliefs about what they think the experiment is about. Instead of doing what you tell them to do, they read what you're telling them and then make some guesses, right? And when they do that, when they start to make those guesses based on the directions, it's possible that you've introduced demand characteristics, right? Where something in your instructions has tipped them off to, okay, well, this is how I should be responding, rather than just naturally responding how they typically would to manipulation of the variable. So if you're worried about that, if you're worried about subject bias being too strong a factor, you might go with environmental manipulation, right? This is where instead of just giving them different instructions, you're going to be manipulating their experiences in some other way, typically doing different things to them or changing the setting they're in, changing the experiences that they're presented with. Not surprisingly, this can be harder to standardize than an instructional manipulation. Right? On the flip side, they're usually a lot more fun. Right? This is where, when designing an experiment, you can get really creative and do some interesting stuff with science. Right? Where you could, go in an elevator and stand facing backwards, wearing either an NFL jersey or a three-piece suit. Right? And you're looking at, the effects of if people will conform to your behavior depending on how you're dressed. Right? That's kind of a fun thing to do. That's a lot more fun than giving somebody a piece of paper with some instructions. And then you can go a step further with environmental manipulation and do something where you use confederates. I think your book refers to them as stooges, right? This is where some experimenters or colleagues of the experimenters play a role in interacting with participants. They typically pretend to be some other participants, most commonly. And what this does for you a lot of times is it can gain you some ecological validity, right? It helps make the manipulation of the independent variable look more like it would in the real world, right? One example, working on a study years back looking at male answer syndrome, which was this idea of the tendency that men tend to make up answers to things, to questions, when they don't know the answer to them at all, more so than women. I participated in a study when I was an undergrad, and I played the role of Confederate, where we brought in a male participant, female participant, and then I was the third person in there, and we were all, participants, so they thought, and we were given a set of questions and told to discuss them, right? And so sometimes, so for half of the participants, I would kind of fulfill that role of the male answer syndrome and make up answers to see, okay, whenever a man does do that, what happens? And then, okay, what happens if the Confederate doesn't kind of prime the pump and make up answers? And so that got it, rather than just telling somebody, imagine somebody said this, or you actually have somebody in the room saying the thing to them. It's a little more real world. On the downside, this is even more difficult to standardize than other environmental manipulations, because you have to play the role exactly the same every time, and that is really next to impossible to do, because you're having to react to what the participants are doing, and if the participants do different things, your reactions then would be different. But still, like I said, I think you can do more interesting things with environmental manipulations, and opportunities to get really creative in terms of manipulating an IV. And you can be a bit trickier and use more deception, which makes it less likely that participants will guess the hypothesis, and there's less demand characteristics. But then you have the flip side of harder to standardize. So pluses and minuses for both approaches. In terms of increasing the reliability of the manipulation, you can apply a lot of what we've talked about before in terms of increasing the reliability of measurement of variables when we're talking about the manipulation of variables. So thinking about those same types of ideas. And the idea here being that, you want to be confident that your approach to measuring some variable accurately and faithfully assesses differences in that variable, right? That's when we talk about reliability of measurement. But you also want to be confident that what you do to or with participants to manipulate the independent variable accurately and faithfully represents different levels of that variable. So, if you wanted to look at the effect of depressed mood on memory, you might use some technique to create a negative mood in people, right? Have them watch a depressing movie. Right? It's impossible to be 100% sure that what you do will cause the change in mood you're interested in. There's some room for error. But then there's also ways we can talk about to reduce that error. Right? So in terms of reducing that error, we're talking about increasing the reliability of a manipulation of an independent variable. So as I've already alluded to when talking about the different types of manipulation, the biggest thing when trying to have a reliable manipulation is to standardize your manipulation. Right? Have very clear rules about what will happen to participants and make sure that they're followed. As much as possible, you want participants at different levels of the independent variable to have identical experiences, with the exception of the one little bit you want to be different. That of the difference in the IV. Everything else is happening exactly the same to everybody. Right? And as I said before, this is much easier with instructional manipulations than with environmental manipulations. So what things need to be the same? Because obviously not everything has to be exactly the same. Right? If I'm doing a study looking at the effects of depressed mood on memory, right? So I'm going to have show people a depressing movie, or I'm going to show them an uplifting or funny movie, and then I'm going to be measuring their memory. Okay, what things should be standardized in terms of people's experiences? Well, everybody watching the depressed movie should watch that depressed movie roughly the same time. Right? We don't want some people early in the morning, some people late at night. We don't want some people coming in drunk, some people coming in sober. We want that all to be the same. for both conditions, and then looking across conditions, which is even more important. We probably want them watching the movies in similar places, right? We don't want one group watching the depressing movie in a theater together, and then the other group, oh, they're watching funny movies, but they can just do it at home, do it on Netflix. Now, my levels of the IV are different in more ways than one, right? I've introduced this other difference, this confound, right, where the experience differs not only in terms of depressed versus not depressed, it also differs in terms of there's this social interaction versus an isolated experience, right? But in terms of does everything have to be exactly the same? No, like for that, I'm probably not too worried if everybody had exactly the same meal. Right? If I'm doing a study that looks at some physiological thing, looking at cortisol levels, maybe I'll pay a little bit more attention to what people are eating and other kind of things like that. So really, what matters is, okay, is anything going to be different between these groups or even within the groups that I need to control, that where if I don't control it, it's going to cause some significant differences in my dependent variable, the thing I'm interested in measuring. If not, then it's not that big a deal. If it is, well, if this is different all over the place, it can affect the dependent variable, then that needs to be standardized. That needs to be the same across individuals within a condition and across conditions, where the only difference across conditions is the thing you want to be different. Right? Okay. Another thing to think about would be using single and double blind experimental designs. A single blind typically is when the participants in a study don't know which level of the independent variable they're receiving. They may not even know what the study's hypothesis is. So some important information about the study is being withheld from them. Typically, it's what level of the IV they're in, and maybe additionally what the hypothesis is. A double blind then is when both the participants don't know which group they're in and possibly the hypothesis, and then the people administering the independent variable don't know which group they're in. So often there's some set of experimenters that know, okay, because you have to keep track who's in which group, right? But if I know which group people are in, I'm not going to interact with them directly, because if I interact with them directly, I may subconsciously, unconsciously, inadvertently influence their behavior in line with what I hope they do, right? I'm introducing experimenter bias. So if I want to reduce those as possible explanations, when I find my treatment works, whatever my independent variable has an effect, I want to be able to say, well, it wasn't because we treated them differently because we had experimental bias. It wasn't because, well, they knew what they were supposed to do and it's subject bias. If they don't know what's going on in terms of what level the IV they're in and the experimenter doesn't know, those explanations are taken away. Now I have much more confidence that any difference that is found is really due to the independent variable, right? So now I have much better internal validity. And that comes from increasing that reliability by reducing experimenter error and error on the part of participants. Another similar approach would be to the use of placebos or placebo groups. So when thinking about kind of a classic two-group experimental study, we do something to one group, and if we do nothing to the other group, you come into the study and they say, okay, you're going to be assigned to one or two groups, and then we're going to ask you some questions. And you come in and you sit in a room, and they say, okay, time for some questions. Okay, well, nothing happened to me. I must be in the control group, right? They didn't give me a pill. They didn't make me watch a movie. They didn't do anything to me. Then, okay, I'm just going to answer questions however. So what's happened there is you figured out part of the experiment. And if you're in the other group, you go in and you say, wow, geez, they made me watch this crazy movie. I must be in the experimental group. They must want to know what happens when you watch this crazy movie. Right? So we're introducing demand characteristics, right? And it's going to influence participants' behavior, potentially, in ways that may mask the true effect of the independent variable. So one solution to this is to use a placebo to help disguise which level of the independent variable a participant is receiving. right? And a placebo is typically thought of in terms of pills, right? When we teach them, usually you think, oh, well, yeah, you get the pill that has the drug, or you get a sugar pill, right, or some inert substance. But placebos, the idea of placebos can be applied to other manipulations as well. The main thing to keep in mind for what a placebo is that the placebo group gets a level of the independent variable that's expected to have no effect on the dependent variable. Um, And so that way, you can't guess that you're in the control group or the experimental group. Everybody thinks they're in the experimental group. So the idea being that, well, if you think you're in a drug trial and you're getting a drug, I'm getting a drug, I must be getting better. There's going to be some expectancy effect. Well, with a placebo group, everybody should have that expectancy effect. So the little bump, you get the little increase in whatever positive behavior you're looking for, well, that should happen to everybody. So then, any difference you see between the placebo group and the really truly experimental group is due to the IV. You're getting that difference above and beyond an expectancy effect. Some problems with that in clinical studies. Obviously, ethical concerns being one, and then practical concerns as well. Thinking about therapy studies. What's a placebo therapy? Right? And for a while, people thought, okay, well, we'll do this active therapy where we have these cognitive behavioral components, and then we'll compare that to this supportive therapy, which is really just nothing. Just a therapist listening to somebody talk about their problems. And I kept finding, hey, guess what? When people talk to a therapist about their problems, they get some benefit out of that. Right? So this idea of that supportive therapy was placebo, was nothing, was inert, not really true. So it's hard to get an inert therapy, a therapy that doesn't do any good for somebody. So more often in clinical research now, what you do, if you say, okay, I've got this treatment, I want to see how it works. You compare it to some other type of therapy, an established therapy, the kind of standard of care often. Here's what people typically get. I want to see if this other therapy is as good as that or possibly better. Right? Additionally, if you're going to, another approach would be to use a placebo control group. So instead of getting no therapy, you just 50 people sign up. Yeah, I want to be in the study, and then okay, 25 of you, you're going to start therapy now. The other 25, you're going to be assigned to a wait list where you're going to get therapy, but not for a month, right? And that way, we can be measuring both groups during this whole time. So you're not getting therapy, but you're still measuring on the dependent variable. So you can compare the group that's getting therapy to the one that's not and see this difference, right? They go, oh, that's a good solution. One problem. If for clinical studies, therapy studies, if you're really depressed and you see advertised, hey, there's this study where free therapy, come sign up. You go, oh, that sounds good. Maybe this will finally help me. And then they tell you, yeah, sign up for the study. You're going to be either assigned to get treatment now or assigned to a wait list where you have to wait a month. Okay, if I'm really depressed, I might think, okay, I got a 50-50 chance of either getting therapy now or not getting it. Yeah, sorry, I don't want to play. I'm going to go somewhere else and get some therapy. I need to start now. So you end up getting this kind of selection bias, which will negatively impact your external validity, where the more severe cases won't opt into those studies because they don't want to sign up knowing there's a chance that they're going to be assigned to a wait list. So you may end up getting people with more moderate to mild levels of impairment of whatever disorder or problem you're looking at. Another issue, even though the whole idea behind the placebo is, well, now you can't guess what condition you're in. Sometimes you can, again, depending on what type of placebo we're talking about. If we're talking about drug studies, one of the problems that they sometimes run into is that when you get the real drug, often drugs have side effects, right? And so you start getting these physical side effects, and you go, geez, okay, I know I'm getting the real drug because I've got dry mouth and all these things. And so now that group knows they're in the experimental condition, and they change their behavior accordingly. Same thing with the placebo group. They're going to experience fewer side effects. They're going to have some side effects because of expectancy effects, but not nearly as strong because there is no biological thing pushing those side effects. And so many of them will figure out, oh, hey, oh man, crap, I got stuck in the sugar pill condition. This isn't doing anything to me. And so they may figure out that they're in the placebo condition, and then you're back where you started with those expectancy effects and demand characteristics. Okay, real quick concept check. Make sure we're all on the same page here. Imagine you're interested in the effects of sleep deprivation on concentration. You present, not prevent, you present half of your subjects. I'm sorry. I think I have sleep deprivation. You prevent half of your subjects from sleeping for 24 hours. You ensure that the other half of the sample sleeps for at least 6 hours during the same time. Then you measure their ability to concentrate for both groups. What things would be important to standardize across conditions to have good reliability? I can think of a couple things. Probably intake of stimulants, how much coffee they're drinking, Adderall, cocaine, methamphetamines, what have you. Caloric intake might matter here in terms of sugar and their energy level, water and dehydration. These are things that can impact concentration, and they're not necessarily directly related to sleep deprivation. It may be related to amount of time you are taking these things, right? So it's a secondary effect, not really the effect of not sleeping. It's the effect of having more coffee or not having enough water, whatever it is. What else? Maybe a level of physical exertion, exposure to media, right? If people that are trying to stay up for 24 hours or watching lots and lots of TV or staying online a lot, okay, maybe it's that thing that's affecting them that will then affect their concentration positively or negatively. But it's not then the sleep deprivation that's causing the difference, if there is a difference. It's this other thing. So you want to make sure that across the two groups, those things are held constant. Either everybody watches TV or nobody watches TV. Other things you can think of? I'm sure there are others. Again, it doesn't have to be everything, but just things in this case that have a reasonable chance of impacting concentration levels. Okay, moving on. In terms of validity of the manipulation, obviously reliability, as we've talked before, is a prerequisite for validity. So everything we just talked about related to the reliability of a manipulation also impacts the validity of that manipulation. The strength of a manipulation matters. Another concern related to validity is whether or not you've created a manipulation that's strong enough, powerful enough to be noticed or to have an effect. Right? So if I'm showing okay, depressed movie versus funny movie, and I show you some people a movie that's it's a little sad. It's not Schindler's sad, but it's a little sad. And I show you a movie that's a little funny. It's not over the top funny, just a little bit. I may not find a difference, right? I didn't sufficiently manipulate the independent variable. It wasn't strong enough. Well, to deal with that, one thing that you should do, would be a manipulation check. Right? And this is a technique for measuring whether or not participants are able to discern differences in the independent variable when it's presented at different levels. So often this is done after the dependent variable has been measured. So if I'm doing my study, I show one group a sad movie, one group a happy movie, and then I test them on memory or whatever it is. And after that, so I don't want to do it before, after that I say, okay, hey, the movie you watched, how sad was it? How funny was it? Right? And I want to find out, I want to make sure that people watching the sad movie thought it was sad. People that watched the funny movie thought it was funny or uplifting. Or I may even say, how sad do you feel? So not only do I want to know, did you think it was sad, did it make you sad? Right? I want to see, did my manipulation actually work? So when I'm doing a manipulation check, again, I'm not looking at differences in the dependent variable. So here I'm not looking at, okay, did it affect their memory for real? No, I'm just saying, did it make you sad? Did it make you happy? So you do it after you measure the DV. Because if you do it before, if I show you the sad movie and then I go, are you sad? Okay, now I'm interested in this other thing where I'm getting you to focus on the effects of the independent variable, which could prime your thinking about the schema related to that, and then I'm not so sure, well, is it the effect of being sad, or is it dwelling on sadness leads to this thing? Right? That's a different thing, depending on what you want to look at. So you do it after you measure the DV, or alternatively, you could, before you do your whole study altogether, you do what we call a pilot study, which is just usually a small, brief study done before a bigger one, and often done informally. Maybe you get some friends together, you get 10 friends and say, hey, you all, watch this movie. And they watch the movie, and you don't test their memory. You don't look at the deep end of memory. You haven't watched the movie, and you go, how sad do you feel? Okay, now watch this movie. How happy do you feel? So you're pilot testing to say, okay, whenever making people to watch this movie, am I able to affect their mood? So you might do it before you do your study to be able to pick a movie that's good, or you can do it as part of the study. Often good to do the pilot study where you do it first, because then if your manipulation isn't good, you pick another movie, right? Whereas if you do it after, if it works out and your manipulation worked, I did manipulate the independent variable effectively. If you didn't, then you got some real problems with your study, but it's already done. So better to do it beforehand, I would say. One more thing, kind of highlighting future stuff. The strength of your manipulation can also impact the power you have to find an effect. Right? So your ability to detect the effect of the independent variable. One thing that influences that is how strongly you manipulate the independent variable, how extreme the difference is between one level of the independent variable and another level. Right? So looking at the effects of caffeine, 10 grams versus 0 grams, kind of weak. I may not find an effect of caffeine. I don't have much power to find an effect. I may need a whole lot of people using that small amount to find the little bitty effect. Now, if I use 1,000 grams of caffeine versus 0 grams, I have a lot more power to detect the effect of caffeine. Beyond that, you basically can try to establish the validity of your manipulation by arguing for it in your paper. Right? You make the case usually based on what other scientists have written or found. So this means arguing for the validity of your manipulation based on theory, right? Where you identify the key theoretical components of some construct, so let's say attachment, and then you address how your manipulation targeted those components. Right? So if I have some manipulation that tries to, and it will probably be hard to do, but tries to change people's attachment style, or at least highlight some attachment behaviors briefly. Maybe say, well, an attachment again is about how you see yourself, how you see significant others, and how you see the world. Right? So maybe say, well, I gave subjects misinformation about themselves. Right? I gave them a test, and then no matter how they scored, I told them they did horrible on it, and that their personality is just horrible. Right? And then I also give them misinformation about their significant other. Oh, by the way, your wife's cheating on you. Which, by the way, that's highly unethical. Never do a study like that. But hypothetically, and then give them misinformation about the world in general. I was listening in the hallway, and all the other participants were talking about how much they didn't like you. Right? You could unethically do all those things. Right? And if you say, okay, I did this, this, and this, because that maps onto what the theory of attachment is, and therefore I did manipulate their attachment cognitions. Okay, so you can take it from that angle, or it's often helpful to use a manipulation that's been studied in the past, where there's some data, some previous research that have shown, okay, when people are shown this set of pictures, played these sounds, they react in this way, right? So this is similar to the idea of convergent validity that we talked about when discussing the measurement of variables. Right? So if you're looking at, okay, well, I want to look at the effect of attractiveness, perceptions of attractiveness on how trusting people are of someone else. Are they going to trust someone that's more attractive than someone that's less attractive? if I go through and find, okay, somebody 20 years ago did this study looking at the influences of attractiveness on people's decisions about how long to sentence people for crimes. Okay, yeah, and they found they used these sets of pictures, and they found this big difference. Okay, and maybe they did a manipulation check showing that yes, there were perceived differences in attractiveness between their attractive pictures and their unattractive pictures. Okay, I may try to find that set of pictures, contact those researchers, and say, hey, can I borrow your pictures? I'm going to do a study and see if I can use that same variable of attractiveness with a different dependent variable now. Okay. So that's another good approach to argue for the validity of your approach if it's been shown to be valid before. Okay. One other thing I think people don't think about as much, and your book doesn't mention at all, I don't think, is thinking about external validity when it comes to your independent variable. Right? When we think about external validity, we often think about the sample, who's in the study. Sometimes we think about measurement. We rarely think about manipulation. But you should, because you got to think about if you're presenting participants with different stimuli and you're manipulating. Okay, some will see these types of stimuli, and some will see these types of stimuli. You're manipulating the variable by presenting these different things. You have to think about how representative were your stimuli of all stimuli that represent that construct. Like there's some population of stimuli. So if you're using that attractive photos, unattractive photos, the photos you used were of some people, but there are this whole population of attractive people, and your photos were only a sample of that population. And if all your photos were of middle-aged Latina women, then they may not be that representative of all photos of attractive people. So another kind of term to throw in here is this idea of stimulus sampling. So if you're really interested in having good external validity for your independent variable, you may think about presenting participants with a variety of stimuli, right, that would be representative of the population of stimuli that you hope to generalize to. And this is something that may not come up for everybody, but it's just one more thing to think about that can impact the validity of a manipulation. Okay, summing up. So, important things to keep in mind. How you choose to manipulate an independent variable, the choices you make when designing a study, most commonly here an experiment, when figuring out what you're going to do to people, right? The instructions you're going to give one group versus the other, the things you're going to do to the environment. Those choices impact the internal validity of your study, the external validity of your study, and the power of your study. So they affect all the in all the aspects of the conclusions you can draw at the end of the study. So an important thing to think about. And when you're writing a paper, you want to talk about why you're making the choices you are to promote validity, right, or to promote power, or both. In terms of your own study, again, I think it's always wise to look at what people have done before. If you're looking at a study where you're looking at manipulating an independent variable, but with a different group, or looking at measuring different DVs, see who's done it before. So if you're looking at, okay, I want to look at the effect of emotion-focused therapy. Okay, well, you don't have to figure out how to do emotion-focused therapy on your own. Find other articles that talk about doing emotion-focused therapy, and find one that describes it in a way that makes sense to you, and say, okay, well, I think I would use their procedure. And depending on how much you borrow from them, you may have to cite them in your method. But that's okay as long as you're providing appropriate citation. And again, before you go too far, always clarify the construct you're interested in. Make sure you know what it is you want to manipulate. And then whenever you're thinking about this, the other big thing to think about in order to write your paper is you need to be able to describe your manipulation with enough detail for replication, where somebody else can come in and do it again. Right? So if you said, okay, I'm going to do one group with motion-focused therapy and another group wait list, and if that's all you said in your paper, that's not very good, because what do you mean you're going to do a motion-focused therapy? How many sessions? What's the training going to be like? What's the content of those sessions? right? Because 10 different therapists, you ask them what motion focused therapy would look like, you get 10 different answers. So you've got to be specific enough that somebody can come in and recreate what you did. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.